over a century and a half, the South Dakota National Guard has a long and proud tradition of service to their communities and country. It's a story of citizen soldiers, beginning with some of the first settlers of the Dakota Territory and continued by generations of men and women who volunteered to provide for the common defense of their state and nation. The journey of the Dakota militiamen began during the Civil War with Companies A and B of the Dakota Cavalry. On March 2, 1861, President James Buchanan signed the act establishing the Dakota Territory. When the Civil War started, the Army withdrew 3 companies from Fort Randall, leaving it in an exposed position. This led to the December 7, 1861 proclamation by the Territorial Governor William Jayne to raise 2 companies of volunteer militia. In just over 1 month, enough men had enlisted to assemble the first company of citizen soldiers. On January 27, 1862, Captain Nelson Minor, company commander, formed the unit in Yankton as Company A, Dakota Cavalry. This was the first unit of the Dakota Territory Militia. This was the birth of the South Dakota National Guard. On November 2, 1889, statehood was declared for both North and South Dakota. This created the need to divide the existing militia units between the 2 states. North Dakota formed the 1st Regiment and South Dakota the 2nd. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, the entire South Dakota National Guard mobilized. The 1st South Dakota Infantry Regiment was sworn into federal service in April. The regiment left South Dakota for the Philippines in May and served through the early months of the Philippine insurrection after the Spanish-American War ended. The conflict is one of the most costly battles in terms of killed and wounded for the state, with 25 men killed in action, 35 lost to disease, and 2 deaths due to accidents, along with 93 wounded. After serving 129 days in combat, the regiment returned to South Dakota in October 1899, where they were welcomed home by President McKinley in Aberdeen. On July 15, 1916, the South Dakota 4th Infantry Regiment mustered into service for duty along the Mexican border as part of the United States response to attacks from Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. They left from Camp Hagman near Redfield for San Benito, Texas. The South Dakota troops spent 7 months on the border, training and watching. They never fired a shot and were mustered out of service on March 3, 1917. On July 15, 1917, the entire South Dakota National Guard was mobilized for duty during World War I. Over 1,500 soldiers from South Dakota's 4th Infantry Regiment were mobilized and soon after reorganized into artillery, supply trains, machine gun battalions, or replacements for other units after reaching Camp Green, North Carolina. One such unit was the formation of the 147th Field Artillery Regiment. The unit served with distinction in France and participated in a number of battles from June through November 1918. 25 soldiers from the unit were killed in action. They were demobilized on May 23, 1919. The South Dakota National Guard would once again experience an entire mobilization of its forces during World War II, mobilizing over 2,200 soldiers. Members of the 147th Field Artillery Regiment were activated for training at Camp Ord, California on November 25, 1940, a year before the United States entered the war. After the bombing at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the unit served in the Pacific Theater and saw duty in Australia until 1943. After some reorganizations, the 147th began the long battle of retaking the various islands of the Pacific and were part of the occupation of Japan. The unit was inactivated in January 1946. The remainder of the South Dakota units served in the European theater. On February 10, 1941, the 109th Engineer Regiment, 109th Quartermaster Regiment, and the 34th Signal Company were called into active service and assembled under the 34th Division. The 34th Division landed in Oran, North Africa, in January 1943. They participated in the North Africa Campaign, the Italian Campaign, and the occupation of northern Italy after May 1945. The South Dakota troops were discharged later that year. By the end of the war, 61 soldiers were killed in action. 7 suffered non-combat deaths. 31 soldiers were taken as prisoners of war, and an untold number were wounded. Shortly after World War II, on July 10, 1946, Medal of Honor recipient and Marine ace Joe Foss was appointed to form an Air National Guard squadron in Sioux Falls. The mission of the squadron would be to recruit and train air and ground crews to a level of operational proficiency, which would enable them to intercept and destroy enemy airborne weapons. The equipment slate for the proposed unit included 25 of the fast and maneuverable P-51 Mustangs, a first-line fighter of the day. Authority to activate the 175th Fighter Squadron was issued, and on September 20th, 1946, the organization received federal recognition. The entire South Dakota National Guard would once again see federal service, this time in support of the Korean War. In July 1950, units were mobilized with the 196th Regimental Combat Team for service in Alaska. The combat team was made up of 3 battalions of infantry, the 147th Field Artillery Battalion, the 200th Engineer Company, and a medical detachment. The 109th Engineer Battalion was mobilized on September 3, 1950, and trained at their mobilization station for 8 months prior to being sent to West Germany. During their one-year tour in Germany, they controlled bridging operations over the Rhine River. They also had temporary duty in France for 2 months, building roads for the French military. All South Dakota soldiers were returned home off active duty in 1952. The mounting U.S. and Soviet Union tensions during the Berlin crisis in August and September 1961 prompted increased military readiness for the nation. 7 South Dakota National Guard units were called into active federal service stateside for nearly a year on October 1, 1961. The 740th and 741st Transportation Companies reported to Fort Carson, Colorado, the 211th Engineer Company to Fort Lewis, Washington, the 1st of the 147th Field Artillery Battalion to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the 115th Signal Company and 730th Medical Company to Fort Riley, Kansas, and the 214th Engineer Company to Fort Polk, Louisiana. All units were released from active duty in August 1962. As rain and floodwaters descended upon Rapid City and surrounding Black Hills communities on June 9, 1972, so did members of the South Dakota National Guard. The National Guard was there to immediately assist in search, rescue, and recovery operations. In what would be one of the largest state active duty missions in the organization's history, over 2,900 Guard members were called up to serve in what some historians have deemed the worst natural disaster in South Dakota state history. The flood claimed the lives of 238 people, including 3 guardsmen who perished attempting to save the lives of their fellow community members. The swift action of the National Guard, working in concert with civilian authorities, helped maintain order and save lives in the Black Hills area. Some estimates were said to have run as high as 1,000 individuals saved. In 1990, the South Dakota Army National Guard mobilized 6 units for duty in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq in support of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in response to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait. The South Dakota units participating were the 109th Engineer Group, 730th Medical Company, 1742nd Transportation Company, 740th Transportation Company, 747th Highway Regulating Team, and the 57th Movement Control Team. Also, a total of 68 South Dakota Air National Guard members were activated and completed various duty assignments stateside and in Saudi Arabia. The South Dakota Air National Guard saw service in a number of operations in the 1990s. The United States invasion of Panama, codenamed Operation Just Cause, occurred from December 1989 to January 1990. Various 114th Tactical Fighter Group personnel participated in the operation. Operation Provide Comfort 2 were military operations by the United States and some of its Gulf War allies to defend Kurds fleeing their homes in northern Iraq in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War and deliver humanitarian aid to them. The 114th Tactical Fighter Wing was one of the first 4 Air National Guard units tasked to deploy and provide combat air patrol missions over the northern no-fly zone of Iraq from December 1993 to January 1994. The South Dakota Army National Guard also saw involvement in peacekeeping operations in the Balkans in the 2000s. The Stabilization Force was a NATO-led multinational peacekeeping force in Bosnia and Herzegovina following the Bosnian War. The 1085th Medical Company, as an air ambulance unit, deployed to Bosnia to provide aerial medical evacuation support for NATO forces from February to October in 2000. The unit would once again return to the region as a part of the Kosovo Force, another NATO-led international peacekeeping force responsible for establishing a secure environment in Kosovo as it faced a grave humanitarian crisis. The 1085th deployed from September 2003 to October 2004. The unit made a second trip to the region from April 2008 to April 2009, this time deploying as Company C, 1st Battalion, 189th Aviation Regiment. President George W. Bush authorized a partial mobilization of the reserves on September 15, 2001 for homeland defense and civil support missions in response to the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 at the New York World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The 665th Maintenance Company mobilized in South Dakota to support security operations at Ellsworth Air Force Base near Rapid City and Joe Foss Field near Sioux Falls, home of the South Dakota Air National Guard. Detachment 3's 665th Maintenance Company conducted similar operations at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and the National Training Center. The 235th Military Police Company also mobilized to provide security support at Fort Carson, Colorado. The war in Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001, as the U.S. Armed Forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom in response to the September 11th attacks, with the stated goal of defeating al-Qaeda and ending its use of Afghanistan as a base for terrorist operations and defending the homeland. By 2018, 18 South Dakota National Guard units and over 1,700 soldiers and airmen were mobilized in support of Operation Enduring Freedom operations. The units provided this support throughout the various regions of Afghanistan and have provided engineers, security forces, transportation, military police, firefighters, aviation, training teams, and command and control elements. During this time frame, no combat deaths occurred to South Dakota Guard forces. However, one soldier was killed in a non-combat related accident. The Iraq War, or Operations Iraqi Freedom and New Dawn, was a conflict that occurred from March 2003 to December 2011. The beginning phases of the operations found units mobilized and deployed to various locations. Some of the units were involved in the initial push from Kuwait into Iraq and Baghdad. Their missions included transportation of supplies and equipment, engineer and medical support, airport and base camp construction, aviation operations, logistics support, and security. There were 25 units and more than 4,000 soldiers and airmen who deployed in support of the nearly decade-long war. 7 South Dakota Guard soldiers lost their lives during the war, 5 to combat-related deaths and 2 non-combat-related deaths. Since 2015, as a part of the U.S. and coalition forces' response to the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, South Dakota units continue to deploy to the region to support stability operations in support of Operation Spartan Shield and Inherent Resolve. So far, about 475 soldiers from 6 units have contributed to these operations by providing engineer, bridging, logistics, and aviation medevac support. When not defending the nation's interests abroad, the National Guard supports the state by providing an enhanced in-state mission capability and response at the direction of the governor in support of civil authority during times of emergencies and natural disasters. Throughout the years, these disasters have called forth the Guard's spirit of teamwork and sacrifice to battle floods, fires, blizzards, and tornado destruction. The Rapid City flood of 1972, the 1998 Spencer tornado, the 2000 Jasper fire, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, the 2011 Missouri River flood, and Winter Storm Atlas in 2013 are all historic examples of when the South Dakota National Guard mobilized to help its fellow South Dakotans and Americans in times of need. As the South Dakota National Guard looks toward the future, never in its history has it been better trained, better equipped, or more heavily relied upon than it is today. The proud heirs of the great militia tradition stand ready to leave the comforts of home and family to help their friends and neighbors defend the nation's interests and bring peace and hope to people throughout the world. The soldiers and airmen of the South Dakota National Guard are proud to add to its legacy and tradition as a force ready to support and defend our communities, state, and nation.